Sometimes when I go row, I'll go out and I'll use the beginner's mind. I have been rowing for 43 years, but I'll go out and I'll just pretend like I've never rowed before. So every experience is new. Every breath I take, every movement up the slide, every drive, as it's called, there's a freshness in that. You start to notice things that you hadn't noticed before. And the same thing with leadership teams. They start to notice things they hadn't noticed before. Sometimes the simpler solution, which is not always the easier solution, sometimes a simpler solution is the best solution.
Welcome to Magic in the Moment, Mindfulness in Real Time. My name is Clayton Platt, and I'll be your host for this podcast journey. And for many people, practicing mindfulness has very little to do with sitting on a cushion, lighting incense, or even focusing on their breath. Just paying attention to what they're doing at any moment. And doing this intentionally can create that same magic. Our time together is intended to share how mindfulness plays out in everyday life for our guests. And before we begin, here's a word from our sponsor, Meditation for Leadership. We all feel it, the pressure to keep up, to perform, to push through. But lasting success doesn't come from speeding up. It comes from slowing down, leaning in, and creating the space to lead from within. That space is where we shift from autopilot to intention, building mindful habits that strengthen focus and calm. It's where we stay connected to our values and purpose, choosing to respond instead of react. It's where we unlock our potential to positively shape our own lives and empower others to grow and thrive. That's the work of Meditation for Leadership. If you're ready to create the space for sustainable success, visit meditationforleadership.org. Picture a rowing 8 at full speed. 8 people, one boat. And if you've ever watched it from a bank, or on TV for that matter, but really watched it, you know that there's something almost uncanny about it. Nobody is pulling harder than anyone else. Nobody is ahead. Every blade enters the water at the same instant, and the whole thing moves like a single organism. Now, here's the question that came quickly when I first started thinking about today's guest. What is actually happening in that moment? Not mechanically. What's happening inside those 8 people? My guest today has spent a lifetime asking a version of that question, first in the boat and then in the boardroom. Frank Rowe walked onto the rowing team at UC Santa Barbara with no experience and no expectation of where it would take him. It took him into the 1991 Pan American Games. It took him into the Schuylkill here in Philadelphia, where he's been a member of the Undine Barge Club for years and now serves on the board of the Philadelphia City Rowing. And somewhere along the way, the same principles that made a great crew, trust, timing, precision, and the willingness to name what's actually going on between people, became the foundation of his work as an executive coach. His new book is The Leadership Stroke: Precision, Practice, and Performance Under Pressure. It's really great. And here's the line that stayed with me from the book description, because it could have come straight from a mindfulness text. Most leadership struggles aren't caused by the lack of effort. They're caused by lack of precision. So think about what that means. Conversations that become tense, feedback that lands defensively, meetings that create motion but not clarity, high performers who drift out of alignment. Frank's argument is that these aren't problems of not trying hard enough. They're problems of attention, of not seeing clearly, of not acting at the right moment, not bringing the quality of awareness that precision requires. That's a mindfulness diagnosis. Frank might not use that language, I totally understand, but his book is pointing at the inner quality of presence as the foundation of outer performance. And that's exactly the territory that we're going to explore here. Frank has shared with me a story that I've given a lot of thought to. His team was training for the Pan American Game trials in Boston. They had the fitness, they had the technique. There was something unspoken between some of the athletes. A tension nobody was naming. When they finally addressed it, when somebody had the courage to say what was true, the boat got faster. Not because their bodies changed, but because the space between them changed. I'm Clayton Platt. This is Magic in the Moment, Mindfulness in Real Time. And today we're going to talk about what the stroke teaches us about stillness and what stillness makes possible in the stroke. Frank, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Clayton. It's great to be here. Great to see you. Yeah, I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Thanks so much. If possible, I'd like to begin with that experience with the Pan Am Games. And there's lots of stuff that I want to talk about, but to me, there's really compelling bits in there that bring the intersection between the work that you do, your experience in and out of the boat, and my work in mindfulness and mindfulness in real time. So
Yeah,
if you would take me through that story.
sure. We were training up in Boston, and there were four of us who had been selected for the quad, the four-person sculling boat for the Pan American trials. So at this point, when we were training, we hadn't won the trials yet. So we had to prepare for the trials and win the trials and then go to the Pan Am Games if we won. And so one day we were out rowing, and the coach was a bit back from in the motor launch from us. And one of the guys just had to say something to one of the other guys. And so things got heated. It was really a question of commitment. And that's not a very polite thing to ask of a fellow rower. And it turned out that there was something that needed to be said, and it got heated. But at the end of the day, we all aligned on our shared goal, which was to win the Pan Am trials. And so we got through it. And as you said, it's really true. Everything clicked afterwards, and as a foursome, and nobody wanted to let anybody else down. And we were going to hold each other accountable more than the coach was going to hold us accountable. And it's the same thing when you think about accountability on the high performing leadership teams. It's not the CEO who's telling folks on the leadership team to get their act together. It's the other members of the leadership team holding each other accountable. I talk about peer-to-peer accountability on high-performing teams is really powerful. There's a peer pressure that, like, I don't want to let anybody else down. And that was the same feeling that we had when we were training after that incident.
To me, that's so fascinating. And I love the parallels between, as you described, the leadership accountability and what happens in the boat. And I would take a moment here because the average listener to this podcast has no idea what a quad is.
Right.
I do, not having ever rowed one. I did. And I shared with you earlier that I rowed very unsuccessfully in an 8 in my freshman year at Princeton. It was a mess. It was everything that you described you need. It wasn't, but that's okay. It was freshman lightweight crew. But in an 8, you have 4 on the starboard and you have 4 on the port, right?
Right.
In a quad, and if I'm not mistaken, you've got 4 with each with 2 oars, right?
Yes, correct. That's correct.
And that is intense because it's not like you have to keep 4 oars in line. You have to keep 8 oars.
Yeah.
In
sync. It is. Yeah, it requires a tremendous amount of precision. And one of the things that really, when I wrote the book, it was actually a great opportunity to think back on my years of rowing. And when I do the math, it's more than 4 decades, which is really amazing. But one of the things that you learn as a single sculler is how to perform for yourself and to go as fast as you can. Now, a single scull is, as the name suggests, 1 rower, 2 oars. And what brought us to that point in the quad was the 4 of us were the fastest single scullers. So the national team coach selected the 4 of us and put us in this quad for Pan Am trials. And there's something different about a quad than a single. You have to trust the other members of your team in order to get the boat to go as fast as it possibly can. And that was really the basis of that argument that day on the water. And once we started to recognize that trust was really the foundation, then we were able to relax into that, if you will, and really start to work together as a cohesive unit. And that's exactly what happens on leadership teams. Sometimes you get some superstars, either in a boat or on a leadership team, that they've got the perfect resume, they've done all these things, and they just are not in sync with anybody else on the team. This is not an uncommon occurrence. And working harder isn't going to solve the problem, right? It's working smarter and being attuned to the sync and the rhythm of the rest of the team. And when that gets out of sync, when you lose rhythm, it doesn't matter how strong you are, that boat will not go anywhere.
I'm just picturing some leadership teams that I've worked with, both as a member or consulting to, and some that I've been told anecdotally. And that sense of, what do you do when you've got a superstar and you've got others who are working alongside and things get out of sync? There's resentment flowing different ways, and it's not at all efficient. And so much time is spent dealing with the underlying emotions involved, right? And there's a term that keeps coming up to me right now, which is around awareness. And I think that's perhaps, I'm just going to guess, an underutilized word in the world of rowing, but that kind of awareness of, that's what's happening.
Absolutely.
And I think your coach is saying, Frank, you got to be more aware. But in fact, if you are aware, you start to feel that rhythm. And I guess you're rowing without a coxswain, right? It's
correct. That's correct.
Right. So you're following each other, so to speak. You probably have one person who is perhaps creating an increase or decrease in the stroke rate.
Yep.
Right. But there has to be that spidey sense.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. And so to me, that is a beautiful analogy with when you're working and you're perhaps, let's picture a team working on a project. Everybody's got their role. You've got deadlines, you've got responsibilities, etc. But knowing that you have to trust, and that's a word that you already used beautifully, you have to trust that the other person's doing their job. Right. And then you also have to trust in your abilities, right? Because you start to have your self-doubt that you're going to catch a crab.
I talk about in chapter 1, I talk about I have for each chapter, I have a quote that I add to the chapter. And the quote in chapter 1 is, know thyself, right? You have to know yourself first, either as a rower, what your capabilities are, what your limitations might be, and as a member of a leadership team. You have to know what you do well and the things that you don't do very well, and where you can rely on others to help you, right? And that, again, speaks to the importance of trust, because if you don't have a fundamental level of trust, then you're not going to show any vulnerability on the leadership team, and instead you're going to pretend that you can do it. And that just doesn't lead to good outcomes, as we know. I've worked with dozens and dozens of leadership teams, and I can tell you that trust is really foundational, that without that level of trust, and the trust that I'm referring to is really based on a level of vulnerability and honesty and authenticity that really creates a bond with others. And if you think about that day in the boat, the guy who was yelling at the other guy, he was coming from a position of insecurity, right? And so, but to their credit and to our credit as a crew, really figured out a way to resolve and move forward. And that, one thing to be clear about here is, just because there are 8 rowers in sync in an 8 doesn't mean they all get along with each other all the time. Or 8 members of a leadership team doesn't mean they all agree with each other. And that's okay. That's totally fine. Conflict is a normal part of a crew learning how to go fast, and a normal part of a leadership team learning how to perform at their top level. And so conflict, sometimes people feel like that's a bad thing. It can be a bad thing, but it depends on how it's managed. If it's managed well, if it's managed from a position of real deep fundamental trust, the conflict is a good thing because the conflict will result in the best outcomes that we can possibly get as a leadership team. And that's why this conflict in the boat that day was such a good thing, because it led to better things. If it had not been mentioned, if it had not happened, I don't think we would have won trials, to be honest.
Yeah. Yeah. And one of the things that was just occurring to me about that was that you mentioned, so conflict is not necessarily a bad thing. It can be a very positive thing, right?
Mm-hmm.
But the positive, what I'm taking out of this is that the positive, in many respects, comes from the resolution of the conflict because it's taking you back to a platform of trust. If the conflict is not dealt with, right?
Yeah.
It's bubbling under the surface, right?
Yeah.
And if others are not aware of what may be causing that,
Mm-hmm.
it festers and
Yeah.
bad things happen.
We've all been there, right?
Correct.
Yeah.
So when it's actually then brought, the spotlight is put on it,
Mm-hmm.
and people can then lower their filters. I think, if I may say, there's the filters of how we're judging this person are going down. Instead of saying, this guy's a jerk, listen to them, they're going, wait. And they may not be saying to themselves, but I think what they're accepting is he's got a need. He's got some unmet need, and it's coming out in a shout, but
Mm-hmm.
that shout is a bell of awakening to us. And let's listen to him.
What can this person teach me? Is sort
exactly. And I love that. So
Yeah.
one of the things that, you talk about is like, there needs to be a self-awareness
Mm-hmm.
and then also an awareness of others. And I'm not sure, are you aware of the book Insight by Tasha Eurich?
No.
Highly recommend it. Highly recommend it. One of the things in her research that she discovered was that I think up to 95% of people in the world think that they're self-aware. And the actual figure is somewhere between 15 and 20 at best,
right.
Maybe 10 to 15. But that building that awareness, first and foremost, of what's happening inside you,
Mm-hmm.
and then also what's happening inside your teammates or your colleagues is critical.
Yeah. And there's something else I was thinking about, knowing I was going to be talking to you today, Clayton, that I mention in the book as well. It's a separate chapter, different chapter than the Know Thyself chapter. It's really the power of beginner's mind, right? And I'm sure that people listening who are business leaders can relate to this, but sometimes more is not more. Sometimes more is less. And I tell a story in the book about a CEO that I was working with and his leadership team, a publicly traded company that was missing its earnings every quarter. It was a pretty miserable time for that CEO in particular. He was under a tremendous amount of pressure, and he kept wanting to get more data, more reports, more analytics, more dashboards. And I was thinking, maybe we can do this a little differently. Maybe we can just talk to the head of sales and find out what's going on rather than pull out yet another report. And so I think there's a comfort in obfuscating things and using big words and being very technical in our jargon and all that stuff. And you know what? That just, a lot of times it keeps leadership teams, individual members of leadership teams, apart from each other rather than together. And sometimes when we think about it from a beginner's mind standpoint, it's all new, it's all fresh. We're meeting these people for the first time. Sometimes when I go row, I'll go out and I'll use a beginner's mind. I have been rowing for 43 years, but I'll go out and I'll just pretend like I've never rowed before. So every experience is new. Every breath I take, every movement up the slide, every drive, as it's called, it's a sequence when the oars are in the water and you're pressing your legs to the finish. Every recovery, which is the word they use for coming up the slide with the oars off the water. It's all new. There's a freshness in that. And you can speak to this better than I can, but you start to notice things that you hadn't noticed before. And the same thing with leadership teams. They start to notice things they hadn't noticed before. Sometimes the simpler solution, which is not always the easier solution, sometimes a simpler solution is the best solution.
I love that. sense of the beginner's mind. It's a concept that's near and dear to my heart. And I know that you've included it in your book. I'm thinking about that great quote from the Zen master Shunryu Suzuki: in the beginner's mind, there are many possibilities, but in the experts, there are few.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And that clearly plays out in the boardroom and in leadership, but
Mm-hmm.
it also, I think, must have played out in your experience when you were trying to decide sports at UC Santa Barbara,
Mm-hmm.
and you had two sports that you excelled in, but you ended up picking a third sport.
Yeah.
Tell me about that.
It was a funny journey. When I got to Santa Barbara, I had a notion that I might be able to walk onto the tennis team. And it turns out it was a pretty good tennis team. So it was a bit above my level. And so then my other favorite sport growing up was skiing. We used to ski a lot up at Mammoth Mountain from Southern California. We drive up and ski. And it turns out Santa Barbara had a ski team. So I joined the ski team for a while, but then the 5-hour drives from Santa Barbara to Mammoth to do ski racing just wasn't very practical. So I quit the ski team. And then when I came upon rowing, it was only because a guy on my dorm floor was a coxswain. And he said, you should try this. And besides, we need one more guy to fill out the 8. That's how small our club rowing program. This was not Princeton rowing. This was a club sport, and we had to do bake-a-thons and ergathons to earn money to put gas in the truck to drive to practice every day. But I said, yeah, okay, sure. And I soon realized that it was the hardest thing I'd ever done in my life. It was so hard. I was waking up that early, training that hard, and I got to a point where I literally looked at myself in the mirror in my dorm and I said, you are not going to quit this sport. And I just decided I wasn't going to quit. And here, 43 years later, Clayton, I still haven't quit the sport because I find so much joy in it. But rowing is it's a tough sport. And it really tested me in ways that I really didn't anticipate. And so when you're new to a sport, everything is from the framework of beginner's mind. When you've done a sport for 43 years, it's a little harder, but just like in boardrooms and leadership teams, it's critically important. Let's take a fresh look at this. Let's strip away all the assumptions and everything else and just look at the most basic elements of this. And now let's analyze it from that perspective. And that's the kind of stuff that resonates with the clients that I work with.
That makes an awful lot of sense. And I hadn't planned to do this, but I have to. So you talked about discovering crew as your third sport when you arrived at college. And I did something similar. So after I graduated from high school, and I think you may know, I played on one of the best high school squash teams that had ever been assembled. And I took a year, what we might call a gap year now, between high school and college, didn't play squash at all, and then arrived. And that first year, I was like, maybe I'll try something new. And my father and my grandfather had been very good rowers. I said, let me try crew, right? I'm going to say it was incredibly difficult, but from the beginner's mind, it was like really fascinating. It was something I'd never done before. I'd played in team sports and I'd played in individual sports, but nothing where you needed to be synchronized. So that was cool. And I worked hard, but I ended up giving up. And I want to just touch on this for a second, because for me, I hated the sense of not pushing through. But one of the things that I recognized was, and maybe this gets to awareness, was I was 5'7" at best. And most of the lightweight rowers were at least 5'10", 5'11", or taller. And as you would be the first one to say, it's so hard to keep your oar synchronized when your arms and legs are shorter.
Right.
And it becomes difficult. So I want to just touch into that from the standpoint of the difference between pushing through, following your heart, being attuned to that, and then also in the work that you've done with leadership teams is, when do you have to say, okay, at this point, we need to shift. Let's stop.
Yeah, that's a great question. And actually, one of the chapters in the book, I talk about that. And the chapter is the last 500 meters. So the last 500 meters, right, and as you know from rowing, it's as the Stan Bergman, the great coach from University of Pennsylvania, says, it's asses and elbows. It's just go, right? But it's more than that, because part of what I talk about in that chapter is this idea of which race am I going to enter? What am I going to commit myself to? And if it's not my race, then I'm not going to commit myself to it. But if it's my race, and thinking about leadership teams and organizations, if this is our banner, we're going to pick this up and we're going to take it to the top of the hill because we need to do this as an organization, then we're all in, right? So being selective about the races you enter is part of that. It's funny you mentioned Princeton rowing, but a legendary rowing coach and rower, Mike Tatey, is a former Princeton coach, varsity coach before he became national team coach. And Mike used to have all the recruits, novices, everybody do these 5,000 meter rowing machine, erg races or pieces just to see how fit they are. And if you're new to rowing and you jump on an erg for 20 minutes and go as hard as you can, you're going to learn some things about yourself. And what Tatey says is, you can quit this team, but you can't quit this piece. And I love that. I love that because it really speaks to here and now, right? You can decide later if you don't want to row anymore. But for the next 20 minutes and the next 5,000 meters or however long it takes you to row 5,000 meters all out, you can't quit. So Tatey was teaching them something that rowers can fully appreciate, and anybody can appreciate, this idea of if you're committed to it in the moment, because this is what you need to do, then you're committed to it. So yeah, I thought that was always a good line that he had for his recruits.
That really resonates with me, because the sense of, in this moment, while you're doing the task,
Mm-hmm.
while you're working on the project,
Right.
it's not a question of, oh, I'm giving up now. You've committed to that.
Right.
You've committed to that aspect of it. So
Mm-hmm.
that 5,000 meters, whatever, that 20-minute on the erg, thanks for that memory.
Yeah.
I'm thinking of that. I'm thinking about the rowing tank in the winter. What am I just?
Yeah.
What those races, or for me, the worst part was doing stadiums.
Oh yeah.
Right? And it's like not the steps, but the seats, because they're all concrete rows, right? And you were not allowed to stop that exercise.
Right.
You get up to the top, you puke, come back down, and coming down was scary, right? But you had to commit to that.
Yeah.
And then at the end of that week, maybe you could quit the team if you needed to. And what that means to me, and how it equates to, again, the leadership roles and in our lives just in general, if we commit to completing what's in front of us, we can then also learn what that experience wants to tell us, right? Because there's so many lessons, right? The obstacles, the path, and all that good stuff. But the lessons are in the doing. And then we may change our mind when we're finished that 20 minutes on the erg or the 5,000 meters. Like, we may go, that sucked. But you know what? I just found this little piece of resilience in me that says, yeah, this isn't so bad.
Yeah.
And I just want to add to this, because I come back to this with some frequency. The image of Mount Everest and the thousands of bodies that are at the top of Mount Everest permanently because they didn't listen to that message which said, this is not the time to finish.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the greater lesson is, yes, so at this point, you've got a portion that you need to do, but when that portion's finished, stop and then decide. It's too late, there's a storm coming, whatever, right? Or in the boardroom, in leadership council, whatever, it's like, for me to be my best person and for this team to operate at its best, there may need to be a change.
Yeah, I think that's right. Absolutely.
So for you, the change, you made that commitment and you went into rowing, and that clearly was an amazing life choice. And I mentioned the podcast earlier that I
Mm,
saw you on, and I want to shout that out. So my belief is it's called Rowing Sessions, and it's presented by Philadelphia City Rowing,
mhm,
which is an organization that brings the sport of of rowing to inner city kids
mm.
who have never experienced it, helps them learn something new, beginner's mind, but also supports other parts of their life. And I know that you're a board member there. Please tell me a little bit about that organization, because I just think those types of urban sports organizations are so important.
Yeah, yeah. So, yes, it's a wonderful organization. I just joined the board earlier this year, and I think it's just, they do great work. There are close to 200 kids that are involved in junior high school and high school, and 100% of them go to college or some sort of secondary after high school. And the college rate of kids in the general population in Philadelphia is not that great. But if they get tuned into something like rowing or squash, as Clayton from Squash Smarts,
Mhm.
and they really focus, then they can do just about anything. And in fact, right now on LinkedIn, there are PCR is profiling the graduating seniors and where they're going to be going to college. And
Oh, that's so
so
cool.
it's wonderful. It's a wonderful organization, and I'm really proud to be part of it and contribute in my small way.
Yeah, I want to shout out not only then to Philadelphia City Rowing, Squash Marts, which is part of a larger national community of urban squash
Mhm.
centers, which again do just as you described, bring a new sport which typically has the admittance from urban students is pretty low, but introduces them something new, but supports their growth in academics and taking on this new sport. So they're really building new muscles internally, both physically and mentally. And these are two examples. I think of Harlem lacrosse. There are lots of different organizations like this. And I want to make that known to the audience, because being involved in them, if it happens to be a sport that you're passionate about, getting involved with those types of urban organizations that support the kids and introduce them to the sport, but also support their learning, their academics,
Mhm.
et cetera, is hugely rewarding and important to that audience and to that environment.
Yeah,
They
I mean,
deserve it. They deserve the support.
oh, I completely agree. And it's funny because when I reflect back on, if that coxswain didn't live on my dorm floor and that guy hadn't, his name's Jeff Lynn, if he hadn't asked me about trying out for rowing, and if I hadn't said yes, and I never got into the sport, the trajectory of my entire life would have been different. And I don't think for the better, to be honest.
Yeah.
And so in a similar way with these youth from these different sports programs, when they get engaged in lacrosse, squash, rowing, whatever, and they learn the importance of teamwork and alignment and trust and performance and precision, all the things I talk about in the book. And then they win races. Actually, this year, for the first time in PCR's 10 or now 11-year history, one of the junior boats, double actually, from PCR, won a silver medal at the
Wow.
Nationals, which is amazing. It's
Wow.
extraordinary results. And so, yeah, it's certainly something that, with a little bit of direction and boosting, the possibilities are almost limitless. And that's, to
Yeah.
me, what's so exciting and why PCR is such an important organization in Philadelphia.
I think that the lesson that we can learn from the experience of the kids who are supported by these programs is that in our own lives, we can find ways to, again, to have that beginner's mind opened up for us and move us away from the avenues that we typically, our cultures, our society, our families have pushed us down,
Mm,
right? To say, this is who you are. This is what you should be doing. Clayton, you should be a banker. Yeah, that sucked. But seriously, being able to say, what can I get involved in that's going to expand me, that's going to
mm,
test me? And the kids who go into PCR are doing that. And their neighborhood, they're going, dude, are you crazy? That's not your sport. You're a baller. I was like, let me try this, right? So the lessons learned go so many different ways. And I try to stay open to that myself and realize that in the decade that I am in my life, the things that end up being most rewarding often are new, right? And I will support sometimes a sport that I've played for years and recognizing that my time with it might not be over, that I can still learn things and just maybe improve my time on the court
Mm-hmm.
by picking up different strokes, approaching the game slightly differently
Mm-hmm.
with the beginner's mind that says, I'm not 40 anymore. And this is what works for someone my age that makes the game sustainable.
Yeah, I completely agree. I have the same experience in rowing.
So in the work now, the work that you highlight in that wonderful book, what would you say at the end of the day is the most rewarding aspect of it for you?
It's, I think, two things. One is the experience of writing the book itself was
Hmm.
really something that I enjoyed. It was like doing a long 5,000 meter erg piece or something, but I didn't mind it. I got into a mode and mindset, and it gave me a chance to reflect back on when I used to be a top level rower and what those experiences were like, and recount all of the races and the wins and the heartbreaking losses and everything, and then see the through line between that and those experiences and those challenges and the work I do, helping teams, coaching, doing team development with leadership teams across the country. And so that was really what I felt like I had a book in me, and it turns out I did. And so that process was really one of reflection. And then once that part happened, it went pretty quickly in terms of just getting down the ideas in the first 7 months or so that I worked on the book. And then it took me 5 months to rewrite it, to make it tighter, more concise, more compelling. I have a book editor and publisher who really was very supportive in that process, and he's done this before, so it was really helpful to learn from him and to follow his guidance, and then it was done, and it was just a matter of putting it up on. Zach put it up on all the websites, Amazon and Barnes and Noble and Book Vault and some others. And then an audio version will be coming out next week. So mid-June timeframe, it'll be an audio version, which is read by Noah, who
Oh, great.
is a PCR assistant coach and also a fellow member of the Undine Barge Club, and a great guy.
That's so cool.
Yeah, yeah.
The thing that I was just thinking about is in a previous podcast episode, I had a great conversation with a guy named Kaihan Krippendorf. And one of the things we were talking about was identity.
Hmm.
And what I'm fascinated in my conversation with you, Frank, is your ability to kind of grow, transition, but continue to like find those ways to add to the mosaic of your life and not be so tied to, I'm a champion rower. You've got that,
Hmm.
but so many people that we deal with, and I think that both in sports as you get older and you're competing at different levels, how people act in the sport, let's
Hmm.
say it's squash or tennis or whatever, rowing, whatever, they've got this identity, they have to be that person. That shifts over time. But also, if you've been a champion, and that's not something you need to give up, but you go through different phases,
Yeah,
and
yeah.
to be able to cherish that but not cling to it so much that it's like if I'm on the tennis court with Clayton, I've got to crush his little tail. you know?
Yeah, no, I do know, because it actually, when I stopped rowing at the elite level, I joined the masters ranks, as it's called. So masters rowing, so
Yeah.
age group rowing, just like age group squash or age group tennis or anything. And I was by far the fastest guy out there because I had just gotten off of the national team, elite rowing level, and it was not very challenging for me. But then after about 5 years, you get this little honeymoon period from the physiological standpoint. You start losing to people that were never on a national team because they're training harder than you and they're lifting weights every other day and they're running stadiums and they're doing a lot of erg testing. And so I had to reconcile myself to a decision. And the decision was, would I mind losing the people that back in the day I never would have lost to in order to keep doing the sport that I love? And the answer was no, I don't mind. I don't like it, but I don't mind. I would rather continue to compete in rowing as a master's rower than not. And because it gives my life a lot of meaning and purpose and camaraderie. And there are lots of wonderful benefits, obviously, to the sport, like any sport. But I had to make that decision. And I know other people, I know rowers who, after they finish their Olympic or national team rowing careers, they do not row anymore. I know tennis players that played a very high level at college level who will not play tennis anymore because they don't want to lose to people that. So I get that. I respect that. But I just realized that the sport was just too important to me. And when I talk about this in the intro to the book, but I realized early on that the race is not always to the swift, but to those who keep on running. And that was my motto when I first showed up in Philadelphia in 1986. I just figured if I just kept showing up and kept training, kept working, I would get better and better. And in fact, I did. But now in hindsight, 43 years later, I realize I'm still that guy who keeps on running because it's not always to the swift, but to those who keep on running. And that through line is a real critical thing in my life and in my pursuit of this wonderful sport.
I think one of the things that we attribute to, I think it comes out in the book, that whole sense of not being so tied to the outcome, to the result.
Oh, yeah. No, that's a good.
Right. But the process, and that's what I'm hearing from you, is that the sport itself, the preparation, the practice, all that, and with the collegial nature with your teammates, et cetera, your boatmates, that's more important than the actual result. Now, as you said earlier, you're not in the boat to lose.
Right.
You're in the boat to win.
Right.
But the total experience, the enjoyment and fulfillment of the experience is not diminished by the result. Is that fair?
I think that's a good way to capture it. And it's also the same with the leadership teams trying to hit a new metric or a new performance standard. And it's obviously the idea is to try to get there. And my job is to help them get there. Sometimes we're successful, sometimes we're close, but not quite. But if everyone is fully committed to the process, as you were just describing, then that gives us the best chance of being successful. There are no guarantees, obviously, but if we follow the process, if we're very committed to it, and if the leadership team is really working in sync with one another and no one's out of sync, then that gives us the best chance to make it to the top.
Yeah. And I think I may have mentioned to you when we were talking before we started recording that, again, a previous episode I had on the show was with Dr. Michael Platt, who I wish was related to me, but he's not. He's a world-renowned neuroscientist from the University of Pennsylvania. And in our conversation, he was talking about how certain activities, when done together, begin to synchronize the breathing and then the heartbeat.
Right.
And there's no doubt in my mind whatsoever that when you're in a double or a quad or an eight, your hearts are beating in complete synchronicity because everything you're doing needs to be in sync. And that is a incredibly beautiful image. And it gets back to then, how does this translate to life out of the boat, maybe in the workplace? And it's if everybody is committed to similar goal, They're all pitching in. They're putting in their very best effort. They're doing their roles to the best of their
Mhm.
ability. There will be over time synchronicity with that. So that sense of whether it's in the boat or it's in the workplace or the boardroom or wherever, where the commitment is to give your best effort, to do your job to the best of your ability, to do what's required of you, right? And being committed to trusting your team. At the end of the day, you may or may not hit your metrics, but I think the odds of you hitting your metrics go up. And if you're not, if the sense of the success of the process not being entirely judged on the 100% success rate of the metric of
Mhm.
what you set out to do, but what you learn from the process ends up being something that is more lasting and can impact basically your behaviors together, again, as teammates, either
Yeah.
in the boat or in the workplace.
Yeah, it's very true. And let me give you an example of that. And there's a method that I talk about in the book, and or that basically that people don't need to change in a fundamental way in order to be more in sync with their teammates. All they need to do is change 5%. And I tell people that,
Hmm.
look, we're not looking for wholesale change of personality and ways you do things or anything like that. But if you change 5% and everybody on the team changes 5% for the better, then we'll have a significant improvement in the performance. And I have an example of a client that I've been working with where they're now seeing that. But it requires everybody on the team, every single person, to be willing to try to do things differently, better than before. And when I say differently and better, I mean in terms of the things we talked about before around giving people the benefit of the doubt and trusting, having a level of vulnerability with the trust that you have, showing your vulnerability, asking for help, admitting mistakes if you make them. Things like that build trust across teams. And so those are specific behaviors that tie to this. So it's very clear to me that people don't need to be thinking they need to change as much as frankly, they do, as long as everyone on the team does it. And so that's a really important concept and one that I've shared with lots of clients because otherwise it might seem too daunting to try to improve this team that's been working together for decades now. What's the point? Here's where we can start. 5%. Can you give me 5%?
Yeah. And it does. It does. And that's been proven in so many different ways. I think behind me in my bookcase, it may or may not be there now, but I typically have Atomic Habits there, right?
Mm.
And, James Clear's book, when he's talking about changing behavior, and he's talking about atomic meaning tiny.
Yeah,
And
right.
so that aligns, I think, beautifully with
Mm.
your approach, which is, and to me, one of the things I'm hearing is that the commitment needs to be across the board. And
Absolutely.
that's why, so if we're all willing to change 5%, there's a sense that everybody, regardless of where they are in the batting lineup, I'm thinking
Mhm.
baseball now,
Mhm.
if everybody, and let me think of my favorite team, if everybody in the Phillies was willing to improve their approach at the plate 5%, my God, they'd be in
Mm.
the top of the league
Yeah,
because all it takes is that the little increment. But if you're so and so, and harder for you to make the
yeah,
say it's a vulnerability which says I'm going to admit that I can get better. Okay, so
right.
I'm pitching in, right?
And even if you see others that don't appear to be pitching in the 5%, and that's where this falls apart because it really does require all of them to go 5%. And even if you see someone across another workstation or wherever, if they're not appearing to put in that extra 5%, it doesn't mean you can then not put in as well. Everybody needs to participate. And it takes, and what happens is it takes time.
Mhm.
Everyone needs to participate daily for this 5% over weeks and even months and months. But then what happens, and this is the magic and really why what I do is a lot of fun, then things just transform. Like almost over, it seems like almost overnight, but 9 months later, thinking about one client in particular, they are a different organization. And the CEO couldn't be happier because they are literally a different organization. And everybody is firing on all cylinders. And it's really cool and fun to see. Who doesn't want to be a part of a team like that? Who doesn't want
Yeah.
to be on a boat that wins the Olympic gold medal? Yeah, of course, sign me up, right? But there's this period of that 5% day after day, week, month after month that you have to stay committed to. And there's a really good lesson there, I think. You have to stay committed. But if you do, good things will happen on the backside. And it doesn't happen a lot with teams and organizations for a variety of reasons. But when it does happen, it's like overnight success and change, which is not really, it just seems that
Right.
way. It's really cool.
So again, this beautiful example to me reinforces, I was talking about atomic habits, and James Clear writes, I love this example. He said, the commitment to making those really small incremental changes in your behavior, whatever, day after day after day, that has to happen before you see the results. And he said, but
Right.
here's an example. So let's say you have a kitchen, and in that kitchen you have an ice cube, and it's sitting on the counter. And for some reason, my kids would say that we keep the temperature in our house at this level during the winter, but we don't. But let's say in the kitchen it's 28 degrees, right? And if you are just turning up the temperature 1 degree at a time, between 28 degrees and 32, nothing appears to be happening, right? But you cannot get to 33 from 26 or 28 without having that change happening incrementally. And that's the thing. You have to believe that this is happening. You have to trust that's
Right.
happening. And then all of a sudden, the ice starts melting. You go, oh, there's the result. But all that
Yeah.
work that was put in needs to happen.
You have to
And
believe in that. Yeah. And that's the other thing. The difference between rowing and leadership teams is sometimes with leadership teams, it's not that easy to measure the results, especially in the near term. Things are just the same. And like, how do you fight that cynicism? In a rowing race, it's easy. You either were across the line ahead of the other crew or you weren't. But in boardrooms, on leadership teams, it's much harder to measure the results, especially in the near term, which is, again, why this can be really challenging because there's a lot of faith. You have to have belief that this is going to be better. And everyone has to share that belief, even the cynic, even the one who's the doubter. But if everyone does believe, then you can have something kind of magical happen so long as they stay with it.
yeah.
Yeah.
So I want to tie this all then back to the world that I'm spending most of my time with these days.
Mm-hmm.
And that is the sense of being present, being in the moment, the mindfulness aspects.
Mm-hmm.
And the beauty of what you describe, again, both in the boat and in the office, and I would say for all of us in our lives at home, that sense of one, the beginner's mind, and being willing just to throw all our expectations, all the life experience that we have in the past, put that aside so that we can see things freshly
Mm-hmm.
and take chances on some new stuff and be willing to fail. And one of the things one of my favorite acronyms is FAIL. So we can't make that next step without taking a chance and sometimes stumbling. But one, having that beginner's mind, and two, being present for those around us in a way that we're willing to manifest our part of this, as you said earlier, regardless of what we see across the street or across
Mm-hmm.
the aisle, right? I need to do this now. I'm committing. So I'm going to show you, and I'll take the
Right.
first step. And I'm going to have the trust and the belief that we're all doing this, but I'm not going to wait to see it.
Right.
I'm going to say, I'm committed now.
That's a really
Because
good point.
among other things, Frank,
Yeah.
among other things, that other person or those other people may be making their best effort and it just hasn't shown up yet.
Right.
Right.
That's
So
right.
having that faith in doing that. And then also when we're getting into the boat, starting a race, when we're getting our team together and embarking on a new project, changing collective or individual behavior, being able to take that beat and a pause and just say, here I am. I'm here. I'm going to do this and I'm going to observe what's happening without judgment. Just
Mhm.
look at it, learn from it. And in so doing, try as hard as I can to stay present with that and let the chatter go.
Yeah.
Because along the way, the chatter is going to be, man, Joe's not doing this, or you're not doing this enough. You really suck. I just
Mm.
have to let that go.
Yeah.
Just be here, right?
Yeah, I agree. And that actually reminds me of active listening, which I talk about early in the book about just because you're actively listening to someone doesn't mean you have to agree with them or debate them. It just means really listening to them and repeating back what you think you're hearing and get confirmation from them. And everyone knows these techniques, but so few of us actually use them. And the best leaders use these techniques all the time. It's very natural for them, especially the leaders that have gotten good at this, who are really strong personalities and very driven. They even learn how to do active listening. And tell me more about that. And why do you think that? And explain the rationale. And you're, again, a lot of executives I work with seem to think that if they go down that path, it means that they're agreeing. And I say, no, it's not that at all. It's that you want to have them be heard. You want to let them feel like you really are listening to them. Because if they don't feel like you're listening to them, it's really hard for them to commit to whatever decision you make. On the other hand, if you feel they feel like you really have listened to them and heard their argument and still decide to go in a different direction, doesn't that then you'll get the likelihood that they'll commit even though they don't agree with the decision. So there's a lot of really important elements in here about being present, and active listening is really the basis of being present. And I really agree with you on it. Totally
Yeah.
align that
And I think
concept.
the process of truly active listening, when you're reflecting back in your own words what you've heard, the person who's speaking to you feels heard.
Hmm.
And that's hugely important because that's where trust is built. Also, as the listener, you're checking back to make sure you understand. And if you don't, then you ask for clarification, right? And here's the beautiful thing: you may be an incredibly seasoned leader with lots of experience. Let's remember the beginner's mind,
Right, exactly. Good
right?
point.
If you can, the act of listening and weaving in the beginner's mind, so you're putting aside, this is what I'm expecting to hear. If I don't hear it, it's
Yeah,
wrong. Whoa, 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 whoa. Because the person talking to you just might have this gem, believe it or not, that
yeah,
you never thought of.
exactly. That's exactly right. 100%.
Yeah. Frank, I have so enjoyed our conversation. This has been really fun. I'm hoping that through editing, we work through some of the stuff, but that's the nature of life, right?
Yeah, it
Uh,
is.
I want to make sure before we close, was there anything that would be important for you to add before we leave? I will say that we'll absolutely have in the show notes links to the book, which I cannot recommend highly enough, the podcast from our good friends at City Rowing,
Mhm.
Philadelphia City Rowing, a link to your website. Anything else that you'd like to share before we wrap up?
No, I think we've covered all the main points, and it's really been a pleasure to talk to you today. And I've really enjoyed this.
Me too. And I look forward to seeing you on the tennis court or the Patel court or the squash court, but probably not in the boat. Blessings to you. Take care, Frank. Thank you. Hey, thanks for listening. I want to give a big shout out to John Gehring of Story Trust Media for his expert editing and wonderful production guidance. I also am deeply grateful for the ongoing support I receive from Meditation for Leadership and their sponsorship. So that's all for now. Until next time, this is Clayton Platt saying, watch for those moments of magic when mindfulness shows up in real time in your life.